Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the seminar series, Decolonizing Green Spaces, Intercultural Dialogues, hosted by Brunel University, London, and organized by Dr. Geeta Ludhra from Brunel University and myself, Giuliana Ferri from the Institute of Education, UCL, and with the help of our wonderful doctoral researcher, Michelle Lee. So this is day 2 of this exciting seminar series, and we are very excited. We have a great panel of speakers today. Just moving on to the next slide, I'm just going to quickly do some housekeeping before we start. So the session is being recorded, and we will upload at the end on our website, so that people who are not able to join us today will be able to engage with some of the themes that we are going to discuss this morning. Just a reminder of politeness, and this is a safe space. So if you have any comments, please do write them in the chat, and we will be giving an opportunity for people to ask questions at the end. With the final remarks, and a reminder to be polite and to show respect for within the space. Also, we encourage you to use the hashtag Decolonizing Green Spaces to amplify the work that we're doing on Twitter. That'd be great if you could do that. And in terms of the running of the day, we're just starting now with the key messages that Geeta will contextualize for you from day 1, so that we're going to use some of the themes that emerged in the discussion in day 1 to guide the discussion this morning with our speakers. Then we have about an hour for our individual speakers that will introduce in a minute after Geeta gives the context for the day. We're going to have a quick coffee break at around 11:40, and then after that we'll have a roundtable with the speakers this morning and some of the speakers from day 1 to see if there are any synergies between the academic speakers and the community activists that participated in day 1. And then we'll have final remarks and a quick Q&A at the end, and we're planning to finish by 1 p.m. So now Geeta will give you the context for day 1.
Okay, hello everyone. It's lovely to see some of the names from day 1 who are returning today. And just want to start by setting the context. And on this slide here, we have pulled out some key messages from the different day 1 speakers. And so that you feel assured that you can catch up on day 1 if you weren't there, we will be having a follow-up ebook, and the YouTube videos, as Giuliana has said, will be uploaded to the website. So I'll start with Anjana. Dr. Anjana Gadwar was our keynote speaker for day 1. And just want to thank everybody for your emails and messages on how you resonated, connected, and how inspiring that keynote was. Anjana, one of the quotes we've pulled out from Anjana is, "We are experts in our own right. You only need to go and talk to the community leaders to find that we are not disconnected with nature." Anjana powerfully shared how her work as an earth scientist has shaped the way she works to genuinely embed EDI principles across all the areas of her work, incorporating a powerful global dimension of knowledges, shining a spotlight on diverse connections with nature. Her keynote touched on emotional, ancestral, spiritual, and religious links that generate important knowledges on nature. Sadly, as research and some of the community organisations know too well, this diverse knowledge base is not always recognised or centred in mainstream white Eurocentric conservation work. What Anjana's keynote provoked us to do is think critically about questions through a decolonial nature lens and urge institutions to take action and change their practices, many of which are outdated and non-inclusive. And Giuliana's currently writing a book, and we're really honoured that she's returned today to pull together some of the key themes and hopefully be part of the round table. Maxwell Iamba is also here today, and he shared his journey as a pracademic, as a practitioner, a grassroots community activist, and someone studying for his PhD at Nottingham University, situated in Black Studies. Maxwell is doing important environmental work around changing the narrative of how Black faces are seen in nature and countryside spaces. And if you don't know his work, just a reminder or a nudge to look at his pioneering grassroots community work on 100 Black Men Walking for Health, which included an award-winning sellout theatre production. Maxwell shared some of the challenges in relation to the legacy of colonialism in the countryside and how the environmental sector and institutions like conservation boards are so white, where some have no people of colour at all. And this is something I resonate with as the first, not only woman of colour, but person of colour on the Chilterns Conservation Board. Maxwell's fieldwork today is situated in Black Studies scholarship, and he is acting in navigating systems to challenge institutions that have historically marginalised Black voices. Adia, who is present here today, but sadly lost her voice on the last conference, so I had to speak her words. She has a very niche area of work in paddle sport, and she is highly committed and critically committed to inclusion and access considerations for people of colour and underrepresented communities in this sport. She touched on important points in relation to organisational barriers and the unique governance structures in this sport, as well as how taxpayer and funding money is used under the umbrella term inclusion, but does very little specifically for people of colour. Adia also raised important points in relation to supporting new organisations, community grassroots organisations like hers, and like Maxwell. She discussed the composition of board directors in many conservation spaces as being exclusively white. We had Kezia, who was the youngest member of our panel and the founder of City Girl in Nature. And Kezia has an amazing YouTube series, which we encourage you to watch. As a young voice in conservation, Kezia discussed the importance of grassroots community work in urban green spaces, and also promoting these first-time nature experiences, drawing on her first visit to a national park. And Kezia was also the winner of a bursary award for national parks, so do have a look at her award-winning video. She has developed her online YouTube series where she documents city people connected with the natural world around them. And we loved the way she talked about this is like her David Attenborough TV series, and why not, Kezia? We look forward to seeing your Kezia series one day on TV. She bravely shared how her personal journey through mental health, knife crime, being a young carer, inspired her nature connection work. She raised concerns like her other speakers on day one around the funding challenges for grassroots community groups, navigating the technical meta language and administrative processes of funding bodies. Kezia's discussion also touched on this sense of belonging and institutional racism. Mohammed Dalek is the co-founder of Mosaic Outdoors. He's also present here today. Mohammed is someone who's an incredibly respected person in green space inclusion work, and this is nothing new for him. He started the work he's doing in the early 90s, working at grassroots level with young people, refugees, asylum seekers, to experience the outdoors safely. And if you follow Mohammed on social media, you'll see some of the work he does on mountaineering and inclusion work on how we can navigate and explore the outdoors safely. He has seen waves of inclusion policies and got the t-shirts for it, and how movements have evolved over time, and also seen the rewards of some of his early work, where young people who he once taught in the 90s are now leading their own community groups. He boldly raised challenges in relation to how organisations are genuinely committed to change, both at governmental and local authority voluntary level and NGO level, and posing critical questions to encourage us to move beyond tokenistic diversity washing. Like Maxwell, Mohammed has worked on projects that recognise some of the colonial history of nature, and you might want to have a look at his Hadrian's Wall video. He raised questions around funding, like many of our speakers do, and like Kwezia, he raised the point about creating a new table and setting different agendas. And then we had Jasmine Qureshi. Jasmine Qureshi is a multi-talented journalist, writer, speaker, poet, researcher, marine biologist, and she's also now just secured a book contract. She is the founder of an organisation called Queer Roots, so do have a look at that on social media, where she's exploring a queer ecology lens, raising critical and intersectional awareness through the centering of queer trans voices of people of colour in nature spaces. And I just want to pull out a little extract from Jasmine's talk. True intersectional learning actually has to almost disrupt, take apart, and dissect the system by which we learn and exist at the moment. And by doing that, we then have to relearn through cultural dialogue and intersectional understanding, and through the behaviour and lived experience of Indigenous people, of people of colour, of minority grassroots communities, and social organisations. So we encourage you to check out the social media profiles and websites of our Day One speakers, and it's amazing that a couple of them can return here today. Thank you. I'll hand over to Giuliana now, just to give us a brief overview and introduce our speakers.
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly introduce the speakers today, and then I will give the individual biographies as we speak to them individually. So we're going to have first Professor Gert Randauer, who is a Professor of Diversity in Public Health at the University of Bedfordshire, together with Professor Nasreen Ali, who is a Professor of Public Health Equality, also at the University of Bedfordshire, and they will be joining us together. Then we'll have Dr. Geraldine Brown, who is an Assistant Professor Research at the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at Coventry University. Then we have Professor Claire Warren, who is a Professor of Metamorphic Geology, Open University, and Dr. Kavita Raghunandan, who is a Senior Lecturer in Race and Education at Leeds Beckett. And we have a number of key questions that we're going to be asking our speakers, and then we will round up in the end after the break for a roundtable with some of the participants of Day One to see how we can all work together, academics and community activists, to challenge some of the discourses in green spaces. Thank you. Right. So, so we're going to begin now with Professor Nasreen Ali and Professor Gert Randauer. I'm just going to give you a quick bio of our two speakers. So Professor Nasreen Ali's research provides evidence for improving health and social care outcomes for marginalized and disadvantaged communities across the life course by influencing policy, design and delivery of inclusive and responsive services and strengthening prevention and early intervention. Recent successful projects and partnerships include the Luton Council-funded Talk, Listen, Change community engagement project, exploring reasons for the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on local communities. Nasrin leads also the BLMK Workforce Research Programme, which has received over £2 million of funding and includes the Arts and Humanities Research Council collaboration with colleagues at Leeds University for documenting migrant carers' experiences of registration and fitness to practice. Professor Gert Randauer is a professor of diversity in public health and director of the Institute for Health Research at the University of Bedfordshire. He has an international track record spanning 30 years of utilising interfaith and intercultural approaches to improving health and well-being. His research is focused on the development of patient-centred care pathways across the life course, from preconception to end-of-life care. Gert's work is internationally recognized, specifically in relation to his work in achieving equity in long-term conditions. And he's also worked with community and faith-based organizations to improve health and well-being. And Gert works with a range of countries within the European Union, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Pakistan, and India. So welcome, Gert and Nasrin. Thank you for being here today. Now there are some questions that we sent you in advance and that we would like now to have a discussion with you about. So the first one was about collaboration between higher education and community groups. So the question is, how can academics in higher education collaborate with community groups to build funding opportunities that produce impact and real change for systemically underrepresented communities? Very big question, but we look forward to your thoughts on that.
Thank you, and huge thanks for inviting us to contribute today. So I guess what I'd like us to start off by thinking about is actually how do we impact upon systemic change? And I think that's got to be a sort of starting point. And I think I'm going to use this word a lot. We have to go on a journey to, one, ensure that systems, institutions want to even think about making change, and two, to ensure that they give voice to people who often don't have voice. So I am literally the warm-up act, because Nasrin is going to kindly give voice to communities who have very generously offered their insights to issues around green spaces. So I'm going to literally talk for 10 minutes just about how we go on that journey to actually think about deep impact change. And what I would say is we need to think about this in terms of not just evidence, but we have to think about, and I'm going to use this word deliberately, playing the game, and start thinking about strategy, policy, action. And I want to share with you my journey, and just to stress, my journey doesn't have to be your journey, but it may offer some insights. So my journey is unashamedly about being an academic activist. So when I was a bit younger and less grayer, I started off literally, full of energy. I was drowning in lots of health inequalities evidence that I was generating, but I had limited or actually no understanding of how I could translate that evidence into policy impact. And I guess going back, I probably was coming across as quite an angry person and not, feeling quite probably frustrated. But luckily, I got myself a mentor. Someone told me you need a mentor. And my mentor then started to explain to me that actually, unless you navigate the journey of the strategic and policy biases that they're actually inherent in our systems, you can't change the journey. And if you want to change the journey, you need companions and you need different destination points. It was the best advice ever. And many of you are probably familiar with the Theodore Roosevelt quote, which is something along the lines that it's not the critic that counts, and it's not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer or deeds could have done better. The credit actually belongs to the man who actually is in the arena, facing up to dust, sweat and blood, striving valiantly, trying again, and is, spending their time on a worthy cause, and just trying to make things better. I've sort of paraphrased in the interest of time. And so that was where my sort of mentor got me thinking about this. So my day job is as a professor of public health, and my mentor then encouraged me to join the system, if I can call it that. So I became a non-executive director in the NHS in the late 90s. And then I became a chair in the NHS and was one of the longest serving chairs for 12 years. And what I learned from that is how you play the game. You have to influence strategy, you have to influence some policy, because unless you do that, you can't make the deep impact change that we're looking for underrepresented communities in green spaces in this case. You can't. So in health, what I learned was, unless you got into the strategic debates about inequalities, variations in outcomes, there was no way I was ever going to get resource. And then I was able to apply that. So in one particular field, so I do a lot of work on organ donation transplantation. I joined their board as a non-exec for 4 years. And in those 4 years, I persuaded, encouraged the organisation to start collecting data on ethnicity. And you'll be like, is that it? But in the early 2000s, that was pretty good going, to have a national organisation to now have a national data set on ethnicity. And what it's led to over the last 20 years is a government task force. It's led to a community investment scheme now that funds communities of different faith and ethnic groups to champion those conversations. It's led to a faith action plan. There's an all-parliamentary group on ethnicity transplantation. So that's what I learned. So now thinking about this question at hand about forestry and green spaces. So I joined Forestry England as a non-executive director. And most people wonder why, because I don't know much about trees, and that's true. But I'm from a Sikh family, and for those of you who don't know much about Sikhism, so we have 10 gurus, and pretty much all those gurus, if you look at all the imagery of them praying or giving sermons going back 500 years, they're actually all those images, especially the public sermons they gave, are normally of the guru sat under a tree. And if you go to most famous landmark gurdwaras, that's our place of worship for Sikhs, across India and Pakistan, you will find that pretty much all of them have a sacred tree. So growing up, I just kind of knew that the Sikhs and most other communities were kind of quite interested in trees and look after trees. And then professionally, I do a lot of work around social prescribing and the mental health and physical benefits of being outdoors, green spaces, and also working a lot with the NHS, which you probably are aware, it's the biggest employer in the country, employing over 1 million staff. So we've got to think about the well-being. So I applied to join the board of Forestry England, and because I had that experience of being a non-exec and a chair, I knew the game. So it's a competency-based interview, and I know how to do competency-based interviews, and I was lucky, I got appointed. And what I've tried to do now in that organisation is to influence strategy. And I guess the way I've done this, and this is what I said, it's about my journey, and I'm not saying it should be your journey, is my starting point was, because I knew nothing about trees, is to go on a massive learning curve and learn about Forestry England and its predecessor, Forestry Commission. So a very short history. That organisation, Forestry Commission, was set up over 100 years ago. For pretty much the first 100 years, which is a long time, it did trees and woodland management and biodiversity really well, because the organisation was actually set up post-World War to rebuild this country and to just contribute to the economic and industrial revolution that this country needed to go on. And that's an amazing narrative. And to be honest, the forest sector should be really proud of that heritage. What it didn't do was people, because it was never set up to think about people and the public. But anyway, 100 years on, when I was appointed, the organisation then started to think about people, and bringing in people like myself, who know a bit about public engagement and community engagement. And the organisation has been on this fantastic journey where they've now done centenary events, which has given them brilliant national and international exposure, showing their relevance to communities of all ethnic and faith backgrounds. And I can honestly say, you know, they've got amazingly technically gifted staff and an amazing camaraderie. And if you ever visit a forest, you will see that they, you know, couldn't be more welcoming, couldn't be more knowledgeable. But their challenge is this, and that's the journey I want to share with you. And you probably heard this phrase before: culture eats strategy for breakfast. And they didn't historically have a culture that was outward facing, people facing, let alone thinking about issues around ethnicity. Just didn't think about people really. So we embarked on establishing Forestry England's first ever 5-year strategy. And I'm really pleased that front and centre in that strategy now is people. So the strategy, if you ever want to find it, it's called Growing Our Future, and it thinks about diverse workforce, diverse volunteers, diverse visitors. For those of you who operate in those sort of tables, to persuade an organisation that's never thought about people to now have it as one of their key themes and target areas is a huge achievement. It might not feel like it if you don't operate in that area, but trust me, it is. And for them to now be thinking about diversity is fantastic, because this is an organisation for 100 years has been so action orientated, thinking about trees and biodiversity, to now create a culture to think about trees, biodiversity and people is quite a significant change. So we've made even more progress on that. So we've moved on from growing our strategy to now having a really fantastic program, which we've called Forest for Everyone. And that's genuinely about thinking about people from different socioeconomic groups, different ethnic groups, gender groups, etc. And again, just for the people who aren't aware, because the Forestry Commission was set up 100 years ago post-World War to build trees and timber production and help us with that economic boom, most of these forests were set up in areas that are not anywhere near where people used to live. So structurally, they're not the most accessible spaces. And that's the journey we've been on as Forestry England. We're saying, actually, we shouldn't be so concerned about the public visiting our forests. It would be great if they did, but as long as they visit some outdoor spaces and green spaces, we're not that interested in if they're our sites, because we recognise that some of our sites may not be that accessible. And again, that culturally is a huge step change for an organisation. And it's been wonderful to see some of the investments they've made. So they've invested now in conversations with organisations like EcoSeeks UK, some of you may be aware of. And what's interesting about those conversations is about asking EcoSeeks what they would like. How would they like to engage with forests and trees? Not how would Forestry England like EcoSeeks to engage with trees? So EcoSeeks went on a journey of initially wanting to think about Guru Nanak forests. So Guru Nanak was our first guru, and they wanted to plant these trees in recognition and remembrance of him. But eventually they said, actually, we want these spaces to be multi-faith spaces. So we don't want to call them Guru Nanak forests. So they've now landed on calling them oneness groves, because oneness signifies unity and inclusion. So they're going on a journey with Forestry England to plant a series of oneness groves across the country, which is fantastic. British Transplant Society wanted to celebrate their 50 years anniversary, so they've now planted a forest with us. And because these transplant surgeons work with different hospitals, the NHS is now thinking about how they can engage with forests. And again, the conversation is about how would they like, as an NHS, to engage with forests. And most recently, there was a new wood just opened up near Leighton Buzzard called Wingwood, and the local Bedfordshire multi-faith communities came together and planted 550 trees in 2 hours, which apparently is a bit of a record for community forest. Normally they only plant 200 trees in a day. So, and there's been lots of other examples. There's a Women in Art, a Women in Forest project. There's an arts project where we brought artists from different ethnic backgrounds to navigate their journeys in forests and trees and produce art installations. And what I'm very excited about, I'm not saying this because Geeta is convening this, we're having a walk in a few weeks' time at Wendover, and we called it a walk of possibilities, because again, we have no wish as Forestry England to bias Geeta in what we think we could be doing together. So we genuinely want to hear from community organisations what they make of forests and what they make of trees, and what is the journey they want to go on, which is why I want to keep on stressing my journey doesn't have to be your journey. And I guess what I would sort of say in terms of advice about journeys, and this is where I think we're going to get resources, is we should unashamedly encourage sectors, especially in this case, the DEFRA sector, the green sector, to look at other areas. So I've unashamedly borrowed ideas from the health sector and shown that actually we can apply those ideas around patient-centered care, but now in terms of person-centered journeys in forests. And we've got to unashamedly amplify those journeys. And I think it's okay when you go on a journey to go on the odd wrong turn and to maybe go on a roundabout and then decide to go left or right, or actually, you know, do a U-turn. That's okay. And I think it's also about allowing systems to realise that they shouldn't be aiming for perfection, but they should be aiming for progress. And I think that's what I try and do when I'm sat around that board table. So progress is about empowering communities, having dialogues with communities and embracing that journey, even if we do take the odd wrong turn. Geeta's probably nervous now, thinking, where's he going to take me around Wendover Wood? I do actually know that wood quite well, so hopefully you'll be all right. And I guess just some finishing reflections before I hand over to Nazreen is, I think if we're really genuine about this journey of decolonising green spaces, when we have this companionship piece, we actually need to ensure that our companions are from diverse backgrounds in terms of their lived experiences and professional experiences. And that means that people like me at strategic level need to volunteer to be on as many interview panels across the DEFRA family, which is how I first met Geeta, and to ensure that those green space organisations are having the benefit and joy of experts in their fields who've got those diverse lived and professional experiences. And I think, you know, we've all got a role to play in making sure that we support potential applicants. And as an academic, I think our job, which Nazreen is going to talk you through, is to give voice to communities, because if we give voice to communities and they offer the solutions, that will answer the question that you've posed to us. That's what funders will then want to invest in, because they know they are genuine asks of the community. So I've done that at pace because I want to ensure that Nazreen has enough time, but happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. That was very helpful actually to provide the context, and in particular how you highlighted the importance of intercultural and interfaith dialogue to encourage participation and visibility in green spaces. And I heard Geeta say shifting power and balance as well in those spaces. So thank you. Nasreen, Professor Nasreen Ali, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Michelle and Geeta, for the invitation. I think that Geeta's made some really sort of poignant comments, and just picking up on the importance of empowering communities, through giving them voice. I'd like to sort of tell you a little bit about what we've been doing at the University of Bedfordshire, driving change, and engaging with our local Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, and respond to question 2, Michelle, which is sort of, what have been the obstacles to green space work, and how have we been driving that change, if that's okay. I think sort of Gertrude has covered that first question really well. And so in 2021, we responded to a tender from Chilterns Conservation Board, which was about sort of engaging with our local Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities in Luton and in Dunstable. They wanted to sort of understand, what were the barriers and the enablers for Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities accessing, green spaces and the countryside, or the Chilterns green spaces and the countryside. So we set about sort of designing a research project. There's a team of us, and I should really acknowledge Isabella Kabasangu and Erica Cook and Gertrude, who were, part of this project team. Our research project was really heavily influenced by, the evidence base, the existing evidence base, which is pretty sparse in this area, but really talks about, Black, Asian, minority communities not being so engaged with nature and the outdoors. And also by the work of people like Dashper and King, who argue that the outdoors is a contested leisure terrain that is both a space for freedom, relaxation, and enjoyment, and at the same time a site of exclusion, hierarchy, and discrimination. And as I went through the sort of analysis, designing this project and analysing the data, that sort of quote from their work really resonated with me, and continues to do so as we move forward to sort of actioning some of our findings. So the aim of our project, like I've said, was to engage with people living in Luton and Dunstable, very strongly with the view to sort of co-create solutions for helping them to use green spaces and the countryside, or access green spaces and the countryside. It was a mixed method study, which generated a huge amount of in-depth data, and Geeta was on our sort of advisory group, and the sort of the depth and breadth of sort of data that sort of emerged. And I've only got 10 minutes, so I can't really go through all of that. So I'm just going to present some highlights from some of the qualitative focus group discussions to sort of bring some of that voice to the table today. So the objectives, we had 3 main objectives for this research project. It was to understand the current level of engagement with green spaces in the countryside. We wanted to understand whether, the existing evidence base says that our Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities don't necessarily engage with the countryside and green spaces, but we know that there's a huge amount going on, and locally in Luton, Gertrude and I understand local community really well and are engaged with our local communities. And we know that there is, sort of local community grassroots types of organizations doing, taking, people, and there is a lot of engagement with nature and the outdoors. So we wanted to sort of address that. And, one of the main, another objective was understanding the barriers and enablers to accessing green spaces in the countryside, and then importantly to co-create sustainable, scalable activities to get the views of our local communities on how we overcome these identified barriers and issues. So I'm just going to really talk about some of the barriers that our communities talked about in relation to accessing green spaces and the countryside, if I may. And so our communities explained there was limited awareness around where to go. And this was a significant barrier for using green spaces in the countryside. They said there was a lack of time was a real barrier to accessing the countryside. And for many of our communities, the priority, they said, was working, earning money, and looking after their children and families. They talked really extensively about the South Asian community talked extensively about the South Asian work ethic, and that, it's driven by, earning money, often sending it back home to poorer relatives or more needy relatives, et cetera, and that this was their priority. Some of our Pakistani participants in particular explained that growing up, they had little experience of visiting green spaces in the countryside. It wasn't really part of their, upbringing, because parents had migrated to Luton, and again, their priority was feeding them, sending them to school, and supporting families back home. Caring roles was really also sort of reported as a barrier, particularly for women, saying that, that's their priority, and accessing green spaces and the countryside is not really, sort of at the forefront of their, imagination or desire even. Transport issues was a barrier to visiting green spaces, especially the countryside, which was, recognised as being further away from urban green spaces, which tended to be more frequently used because of locality. Our participants were enthusiastic about visiting the countryside, but explained that really it was hard for them to get to the countryside because of transport, and the cost of transport, particularly, petrol costs, was a real barrier for larger, particularly for larger families. There were issues, they talked about barriers for those people who did access green spaces in the countryside. They said that some of the barriers that they faced when they sort of got there was lack of facilities. So, not knowing where the toilets were, or poor quality facilities, benches, restaurants, parking facilities. People with disabilities, said that there isn't, accessible sort of spaces for us. There was a lack of sheltered areas for children in case it rains. Overcrowding in play areas in green spaces, sort of having long queues for, with children waiting for their turns for sort of play areas was a real problem. So, in short, limited facilities, it was a problem. They discussed, a lack of facilities, in relation to for older people. Again, there was a real sort of focus on, well, where can older people sit, when they need to, rest whilst they're out and about. They talked about safety issues and antisocial behaviour. This was really a key theme, and they said that there was a real sense of lack of safety and antisocial behaviours being a barrier to accessing green spaces in the countryside. They said that they'd witnessed gang culture and drug dealing taking place in Luton parks, and that this was a real serious concern and a deterrent. Some said that there were overt displays of a sexual nature in Luton parks, which was against their sort of cultural and religious values, and therefore, they found that unacceptable, and it prevented them from, particularly taking children to parks in Luton. In terms of racism and discrimination, our participants said that racism was a real barrier to visiting green spaces. They explained that they felt that racism was more rife further afield in green spaces in the countryside. They said it was more a feeling than it was actually seen or experienced in particular. So there were comments like, well, the way that people look at us, there were lots of sort of, or, we feel uncomfortable because of the way we're dressed. But nobody had actually, said that they had experienced, overt racism, a racist incident. One participant discussed discrimination against children with visible disabilities. They said that, they were looked at in a particular way. I found that really interesting, that it's that sort of covert as opposed to that overt experience of racism. They said that parks were poorly maintained, which was a deterrent. There was a lot of construction and building going on around, you know, urban green spaces in Luton and Dunstable, and therefore, you know, they didn't feel that it was safe for children. Unleashed dogs was a real sort of issue for our some of our participants, some of our communities, and they said that this is a real barrier to visiting green spaces in the countryside. They suggested, or we asked them for strategies for overcoming some of these barriers and increasing the use of green spaces in the countryside. And our participants gave some really interesting suggestions, and they said that a priority strategy, for improving access to green spaces in the countryside is really, it has to start with creating awareness amongst our communities of what is available, sometimes on their doorstep, but a little bit further afield as well. They said that communities weren't knowledgeable about what's available, the location, the transports, the costs, the facilities, you know, available. So they suggested more information disseminated, importantly, through community and religious organizations. You know, again, going back to, you know, Gertrude's point about the importance of, you know, those engaging with those community groups and those faith organizations. They suggested that posters, you know, information should be in the form of posters and leaflets about what's available, again, through community and religious organizations. But also, you know, they suggested cinemas, shopping centres, at the back of buses, you know, were all given as examples of where this information could be disseminated. They said that information could also be disseminated through local radio, local community radio stations, such as Inspire FM. So they were named some sort of local community radio stations. A minority of participants said, well, children in schools should be taught about, you know, the benefits of accessing nature and green spaces for physical and mental health, and that might encourage, you know, them to discuss, you know, the importance of accessing green spaces and countryside with parents, and therefore, you know, possibly, you know, improve, you know, access or improve utilization, you know, usage of green spaces in the countryside. Our younger participants said that social media was a good way to promote green spaces, and they said that, you know, why don't we use influencers or, you know, celebrity promoters, which would generate interest with younger people. There was a lot of discussion around, you know, improving facilities. They said that, I found this quite interesting. They said that there should be designated sunbathing spots in green spaces in the countryside, so that for, you know, certain communities, it avoids embarrassment. You know, there were examples of, you know, children, young Muslim women, you know, going to parks with their father or their brother, and then sort of there being these, you know, displays, you know, of public affection, and how it was really embarrassing, and prevented them from going again with their father or their brother. Improved security in green spaces was also suggested. Our participants talked a lot about the importance of organising sort of trips to green spaces, and especially the countryside, for people who were elderly or lived alone or didn't have the confidence to go out, you know, alone. They may be in poor health, or they may just, you know, have been newly arrived, you know, recently arrived in the UK, and just not have that confidence to get out, or be familiar with how to get out, you know, via public transport, etc., to access green spaces of the countryside. So they talked about the importance of some sort of organised trips to green spaces in the countryside for these vulnerable and marginalised members of the community. So, you know, the importance of, you know, organising culturally appropriate events in green spaces in the countryside was really important. You know, they talked a lot about, well, you know, we've got all of these local green spaces, but we don't really have any music events or plays or the poetry in these green spaces in the countryside. You know, in Luton, we have the Eid festival now in the park. So Eid in the park is a regular sort of event, and an iftari, you know, the breaking of the fast during Ramadan is held at Dunstable Downs sometimes. But apart from these two events, they said that they didn't know of, I mean, there are other events, but they didn't know of any other events that took place. Maintenance and cleanliness of green spaces was really important to them, and they sort of gave some, you know, suggestions on that. They talked about the importance, and again, going back to Geeta's point about working with the community to promote the use of green spaces in the countryside. A lot of our participants said, well, this is the first time that they'd been asked anything like this about, you know, the use of the green spaces in the countryside and their suggestions. So, you know, it was really, you know, you know, going back to the point about empowering communities, you know, through voice. I mean, our communities sort of gave lots of examples, you know, of how they felt. I mean, there's lots of sort of narrative extract that I would have loved to have shared with you if I had more time, where they're saying that, look, this is great. You know, we want to, we love our local sort of, you know, parks, you know, and it's great that somebody's asking us what we can do about.
Thank you, Nasrin. Sorry to interrupt. Maybe we can share the report. It'll be, you know, we can find a way to share.
Yeah, I think we could find a way to add the link to the transcript or something.
Yeah, we could
upload it to our website.
I just wanted to ask a very quick question, Nasrin. Did anyone mention the use of languages used in the community to disseminate this knowledge around green spaces?
Yeah, they did, absolutely. So, you know, the dissemination of information needs to be through community of faith organisations in the vernacular, so the appropriate languages, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. That's great point.
And was there anything, Nasrin? I mean, it's a really interesting report, and we will find a way to share that on our website. And I was nodding throughout when you were raising things about covert racism and, you know, the looks, the stares, the security, the dog phobias. All of this has come up in my walking group. But what we were going to ask is, was there anything around the meta language, the technical language of green spaces that came up in your research? Because as we know, the conservation world, this green space, nature space, it does have its own language almost.
Not really, Geeta, no, because the communities, we were you know, engaging with, you know, the communities within communities and the most marginalized within those communities. And I think knowledge and access to green spaces was so lacking that they wouldn't really go onto a website. I mean, the people that we were talking to weren't the people that were going onto websites to look for, you know, where can we take children out this weekend, and therefore not understanding, you know, that meta language, or weren't, you know, if they'd gone to Stockwood Park, for example, they weren't necessarily able to read, you know, some of the, you know, information that's presented. I mean, there may be with younger people that can, but it didn't really come up as a major theme within our work. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's just perhaps, you know, a reflection of the our sample. I should have said that this is just sort of one part of the qualitative, you know, discussion findings that we've got. We also had a questionnaire which generated a huge amount of data. I just want to take a couple of minutes, if I may, just to say what we're doing. So as a result of what you know, of this engagement exercise and the suggestions that our communities, you know, gave us, we've obviously got a report, and we've presented some of our key findings to the Children's Conservation Board, and we've proposed to develop and deliver a collaborative targeted outreach programme for access to green spaces in the children's countryside. And we want to do this through a series of interventions to increase access to green spaces in the countryside. So, you know, I don't really want to go into too much detail about what we think that might involve, but, you know, as a summary, it's really about collaborating with our communities to increase information and awareness about green spaces in the countryside, to organise guided walks and countryside trips, to for the most, and I should say this, and I really want to make this point as strongly as possible, it's not, these organized trips and guided, organized guided walks are not for those people who are already engaged in some way or another with the green spaces and the countryside. It's for those individuals who are very unlikely to access green spaces and the countryside. They haven't got the access, they don't want to get out there because they haven't got the right clothes, or they haven't got, they haven't got the ability to buy, the right clothes. They don't want to wear the right, those clothes. They don't want to don a pair of jeans with some walking boots. They want to go out into the countryside in a shalwar kameez with their, with their friend, or, dressed in an abaya, or a hijab, and have like-minded, similar looking people with them, or the elderly. So it's very much targeted at those individuals. We want to improve representation and diversity in publicity around green spaces in the countryside to reduce that, discrimination that I've talked about. And we obviously want to evaluate, what we do. So, that we've made these recommendations to Chilterns Conservation Board, in addition to, excuse me, in addition to this, in response to sort of, what that question 3, what else are we doing to drive, work around this area? We, with Luton Council, we were awarded some NIHR funding for a public health practitioner post. And a key part of that researcher's post was looking at changes in health behaviour during COVID-19 pandemic, but in relation to access or no access to green spaces and the impact that's had on physical and mental health and well-being amongst Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities in Luton.
Thank you.
Just one last comment.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Okay, one last comment, and then I'll
Yes,
stop.
thank you.
We've secured some funding from Luton Council, our public health team. It's a match-funded PhD to look at the role of the built environment and how that impacts on diverse communities, with the view to sort of improving, improving active lifestyles through that built environment, and obviously that includes, access to green spaces, urban green spaces. And that PhD is open. We're still looking for applicants, Geeta and Michelle. So if I can send you the link, it'd be great, if anybody here is interested or knows of anybody who may be interested. That's a great opportunity to come and work, with us on this area.
Okay,
I'll stop there. Sorry.
That's great. You can send us the link. Maybe we can help you publicise.
There's a couple of people here, and Jana and Professor Claire Warren, who I know would be very happy to publicise and share in their networks.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Gertrude, for giving us this great overview of the work that academics do with communities to increase visibility and inclusion in green spaces, and also highlighting some of the challenges to access. So we're going to move on now to our next speaker, Dr. Geraldine Brown, and then we'll come back together for the round table. So I'm
going to put the spotlight on Geraldine now. I'm going to remove the spotlight on the previous speakers.
And I'll start introducing Geraldine. Thank you, Geraldine, for being with us today. Now, Dr. Geraldine Brown's research focuses on knowledge grounded on the lived realities of people whose voices are often missing or seldom heard. Through her research, Dr. Geraldine Brown aims to identify factors that contribute to experiences of exclusion and marginalization, and provide evidence base to influence the development of socially just policies and practices. She takes a community development approach to her work and has undertaken research with pregnant teenagers and young parents, Black and minority ethnic communities, older people with mental health needs, and men and women who have come to the attention of the criminal justice system. So thank you again for being here, and I'm going to hand over now to Geeta to start this dialogue with you, Geraldine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine, for agreeing to be one of our panelists. for a little bit of context, Geraldine and I shared our doctoral journeys, shared all sorts of emotions during that journey. And later on, postdoctoral journey, Geraldine and I came back together and connected through a European biodiversity bid, which we're currently working on, looking at some of the community grassroots work I'm doing in the countryside, and particularly the language and the meta language around biodiversity, which often excludes minority ethnic communities in a way that they're almost assumed not to have this knowledge of biodiversity and conservation related work. So Geraldine and I have had some interesting conversations around the language of academia within biodiversity and conservation spaces, and also racism and other areas as well. So Geraldine, like Maxwell and myself, is a pracademic. She is very immersed in not only her academic work and her writing as an academic, but also a core part of Geraldine's work is always to be in touch with grassroots community groups, which is something I really respect and have really leaned into in the latter part of my academic career. So I'm actually going to start, Geraldine, with the second prompt, unless you want to, maybe you start with a little bit of what does it mean for you as an academic? Why is it important for you to work with community groups alongside the academic writing you're doing? And what does that mean when you're in touch at the grassroots level? And then the title of this conference, which is Decolonizing, and Giuliana and I have been talking this morning about the ing on the end of it, and Decolonizing Green Spaces, and we're very critical of how this word is being used, is to unpick what does decolonizing mean in academic spaces and grassroots spaces for you, and maybe even touch on some of the key findings from Walking Warriors, which is a group that you've set up for Black people in the area of Coventry where you live. So I'm going to hand over to you, Geraldine.
Thank you, Geeta, and good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I was revisiting your questions last night, and it says, oh, from an academic perspective, and I don't even know what I call myself anymore, and probably you'll get to understand why I say that as I go through tell you a little bit more about me, my work, and my connections to communities. I think I really love the idea of talking about journeys, so I'm really pleased that the morning started with someone telling you about their journey. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about, well, my journey. So I was thinking, I've always been involved in community work. I've been involved in volunteering for voluntary community organisations. I think I've been doing it since the age of 18, 19. Before I even went to university, because I went to university as a mature student to do my first degree. I think my first involvement was working with a Saturday school that was targeted at African Caribbean young people, a way of not only supplementing their educational journey in terms of maths and English, but also other wider skills, practical skills, and just bringing a community of young people together. And and doing the historical things and alternative ways of understanding their lives that they probably didn't get access to in schools. And I did volunteering for a criminal justice organisation, I think in my early 20s, where I would go and meet often people from our local communities who had been in prison, and I'd be that sort of peer support as they transitioned out of prison into the community. So I've always had a passion and a commitment to community work. And I grew up in a city, Birmingham, and community has always been a really important part of my life, who I am, and I've always felt a connection to and wanting to work through and with community. So I think my journey started with, before doing any of this academic thing, this commitment to community in some way, shape or form. And then once I'd completed my first degree, my first proper research project, which when I think back, I don't remember how, I don't know how it ended up the way it did, but it was working with a community group to generate evidence to get funding. It was a recognition of a problem in our communities where our schools were, where our children were being disproportionately excluded. We wanted to do something about it, and a friend set up a community organisation where she said, could we do a research project together? Could we gather the evidence, present that to the local authorities, and see if we can access some fund to set up an initiative to work with children. So I think my journey through the academy cannot be understood without understanding my journey to the academy. I think what I do in the academy is very much what I've always done. It's just sort of developed and progressed and grown and looked at a wider range of issues. So I think it's the question about how we can support and work with community organisations. Much of my work is that. I do a lot of work with organisations who are doing the most important work in communities, who often need support to gather evidence of their work, whether that is to improve practice or to support accessing funding resources to fund the work they do. So I think my approach, I call it a community development approach, but you know, I think I call it that because it's fundamentally at the centre of the majority of my work, and not all my work, is what are some of the issues in our communities? How can we help organisations that are working with communities? As an academic, what can I do to do that? So I'm going back and sort of losing track. But can you revisit your question again, Geeta? But I just thought it's really important to think about my journey to the academy. I was, and how that, the academy's been a beneficiary.
I think that's really important what you've raised, and what you said about your own journey as in the voluntary sector and alternative ways of understanding communities as well. And my journey actually started at Saturday schools, at a local Black Saturday community school. Actually, that was my journey into education, volunteering. Because actually the Black community where I lived set up their own educational community system, which they felt catered for the needs of their children in different ways with Black and Asian teachers. So I really like hearing about your journey, Geraldine. That's really powerful. I want to ask you a bold question. Do you think academics have a responsibility to do community work and actually get into the grassroots of the work that they're researching, they're writing about? Should we be there on the ground level to some degree?
I've been working at Coventry University for coming up to 20 years, and I've worked with academics, you know, in many different institutions. And I think when people ask me that, I always say you need to be thinking about what type of academic are you? I think I can't suggest that everyone needs to be doing things the same way, because I think if we have people working in different spaces or doing research or in different ways together, we can give a more fuller picture. So I'm not suggesting that every academic needs to be doing things in this way, but I think for me personally, my commitment to issues of social justice and inequality lent itself for me to be doing it this way. And I'm going to say something, that there are some academics that we work with that we wouldn't really want them working with communities. Because
that's a nice bold answer, Geraldine. I like that.
Yeah, but I do feel that if you are looking at particular social issues or health issues, and you're looking at the experiences of communities, then I think it's really important that you are connected in the communities and really ensure that you're working with communities. So I think it depends on what you're doing, but I really believe that if you are looking at issues that impact the lives of marginal communities, wherever they are, I think you have a commitment to be having that relationship with communities to ensure that they're centred to the production of knowledge and that their stories and voices and their experiences are articulated in really meaningful ways.
I think, Giuliana is nodding to that. We were just talking yesterday about different forms of knowledges, and you've made some really valuable points there in relation to our roles as academics. And Professor Gertch and Nazreen, and I know Professor Gertch's work, he is, you know, a professor, and we know how few Black and Asian professors there are statistically, but he is very immersed at ground level in places of worship, the local communities in Luton, and all the work he does there, which really, for me, I think it gives you that edge. But like you said, we wouldn't want all academics out in the field in community groups. So thank you for saying that. I want to touch on something else, Geraldine, that you and I have had conversations about, and Giuliana and I as well, when we chose the title for this conference. We've called this conference Decolonizing Green Spaces. And actually the follow-up next year, we might put decolonizing in inverted speech marks. Would you like to say anything about how this word decolonizing, we know if you're talking about decolonizing with people who get it critically, and I know we've had very powerful conversations with Maxwell about this, who's a academic. What do you think about this word decolonizing green spaces?
So the word decolonizing, what is not to politically commit to the idea that we really need to find alternative and value and center alternative ways of knowing and doing an action. You know, it's a commitment that we can all sign up to. But the concept itself means different things to different people, and that's fine. It's understood in different ways, and that's fine. And it offers us a way of sort of connecting racialized disadvantage with processes of exclusion and all those things. So the concept itself, you know, I can, you know, my life's work, I should say, has been committed to doing that without using the concept. I do feel though, or I do worry that, you know, and it's not the only concept that once things become institutionalized, then they lose that radical edge. So I think it's an accepting that decolonizing and how we do it within the academy, we do it in different ways, it means different things to different people, and making that clear. But I do worry that there's this sort of institutionalization of a concept and it's losing its radical edge. And also that decolonizing is, for me as a Black woman, a Black feminist in the academy, sometimes I can feel it's something that others take that, what's the way of saying it? That it's, yeah, it doesn't mean that my ideas and views are any more valued than they were before. So I do think it's a concept that should be open to critical interrogation, and we need to look at the multiplicity of ways that people engage with the concept. But in terms of some of the core features, I think it's really, really, really important. So yeah, so I'm at the moment, in a way, in a position that I have been thinking about it a lot. I probably need to go back and do some more reading about it, because it's raising a lot of issues and questions for me and making me feel a little bit uncomfortable. So when I feel like that, then it's like, okay, we really need to put time aside to really go and sit, think, and engage in dialogue with others, for me to understand my uneasiness about sometimes the way that this concept is just being used uncritically. It's like it's taken as doxa, and yet we know it's been used in so many different ways, and it may not bring about the liberation and the freedom that I think we anticipated. So yeah, so it's a bit of a roundabout fudge, but the core ideas, you know, I think are critical. But then we know what the academy is like. Things can become de-radicalized, for want of a better word, in terms of how concepts are utilized within these spaces. So yeah, if that answers
That's really
question.
helpful. Yeah. I can see Giuliana nodding there. Giuliana, did you want to say anything about that, about how this term is being institutionalized?
Yeah, no, I think Geraldine made a great point that there are so many features of decolonization, or actually decolonizing, that are worth keeping. but always being watchful with a critical eye, because these discourses become institutionalized very quickly. So I like the way you approach it cautiously, as in, yes, we need to carry on the work, but keep being critical and particularly vigilant sometimes how institutions take this concept and just make it into something that is not critical.
Yeah. And it's about action. You know, it's about action. It's about what we do. So, you know, I think also making sure that we keep that. It's about the understanding, but it's also about the acting on doing something. So yeah.
And what we will do is when we have the round table, and Giuliana, please remind me that Maxwell has a point to raise on this, just because of our timing. So Maxwell will respond to some of this. You've raised some really important points, and I just want to end with Geraldine, for you. You have, like myself, as a pracademic, a practitioner, and an academic, you have recently set up a Walking Warriors group. What are the key findings? Is it just for Black women? Is it for anybody?
So walking, I work at the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience, and I'm no expert around green spaces. I think a lot of my work has been around working with marginalised groups and looking at particular social issues and the interface between the issues, policy and practice. I'm in a space now where I've been doing a lot of work around, you know, when we think about green spaces, I'm thinking about incarcerated men and women. I'm thinking about people in prison. I'm thinking about, you know, how we can humanize prisons through having spaces in prison where prisoners can engage in horticultural types of activity. That could be really good for health, well-being, for social relations, for relations with staff, for people being able to manage the prison regime. So I came from it from a very different perspective. But for my Walking Warriors group, that was a COVID initiative. I went to, you know, I had so many people that I knew that died during COVID. I had friends who were isolated at home, friends who were anxious. I had a family member that I don't think she left the house 5 times over a 12-month period. And I knew I was working with Backbone, helping them to write their report that looks at the exclusion of Black and ethnic minorities in green spaces in Scotland. And I just thought, I'm going to do something. And what I did was just spoke to a friend of mine and said, look, let's just set up not even a group, it was quite informal. Let's just say we are going to meet. We're going to be here in our local woods, our Wally Woods in Bearwood. People come and join us, come out for a walk. And we called around to people in our families, our friends that we knew were struggling. And so that was the start. Our walking group was a response to COVID. It was also a response to, you know, the continual reports about the disproportionality in terms of its impact and Black and ethnic minority communities, but also research that was coming out about the fact that, you know, going out into nature would be really good, but yet there are some groups that had access more than others. So it was my small way of trying to do something with my local community. And also knowing that these people individually are in their gardens, they're doing things. It's not that they don't have a connection to green spaces. They haven't. One was a florist, someone else had a garden that she's always talking about what they were planting. So yeah, Walking Warriors really was just my way of trying to do something for people in our local community. It's open to anyone, Geeta, but I suppose the conversation started between 2 Black women, and then we contacted people in our local community and family and friends. So then it became what it is, but it's an opportunity really for us to connect with each other, for us to connect with nature, for us to be able to offload the stresses of our weeks. And it's been an absolute, it's illuminated so many different things that you can read about and you can know, but when you're seeing it firsthand in your own walking group, it's amazing we are, we've got someone who's got cancer and she's come along, and the group's been a really source of support. We've got someone that's facing some really awful racism in their workplace, and they come along, they get outdoors, we have conversations. We have a couple of academics who spend the first 10 minutes, ranting about the academy. And then we have some young people who are having conversations with older people, and they're supporting each other. So we're just trying to build a community, and the community is at the heart of our walking group. They don't want to go to many places. I try to say, shall we go and walk here? They're quite happy for us just to come together in this space. But it's really a way of just building community, for us to self-organize, for us to come together as a group, no rules. We just meet up, and we don't have a distance we need to travel. We just go at our own pace, and we just unwind and find joy with each other and being outdoors in the way that suits us best. So yeah, it's not a walking group like many others. It's really trying to build a community. And I think I'll just want to leave it here that, the idea also came from looking at the work that you're doing, Geeta, and the work that people were doing in Coventry, like Steppers UK. So I could see people around me doing things as well. And I thought, do you know what, this is something that I can do. And it's just led to unleashing people's creativity. Everyone now is a photographer. Every week they're saying, Geraldine, we need to capture some of these moments. People are writing poetry. The kids are making short films. And they're really pushing me to do my own ethnographical study about the group, because I think it's just so important to share with others. So yeah, it's a community initiative, and yeah, it's something that I've just grown to love.
I think the ethnographic study, Geraldine, would be fantastic.
Yeah, I think it's heartwarming, and thank you for acknowledging Gadima's group as well, because the stories that we've shared before from people from all walks of life, and I say this quite boldly today, I don't know if they would have, as a woman of colour myself, and I attract a lot of South Asian walkers who come to my group, that actually they share and offload certain things in different ways, because there is that safe space and trust. And it makes me think about as well the work that pioneering work that Maxwell's done with 100 Black men walking for health. There's a lot of resonating there as well. So Geraldine, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on today. I'm really excited about working with you.
Yes, me too.
Biodiversity, or is this word not going to be used in our work? And how do we talk to communities about biodiversity? But thank you, you've raised really important points around the language of decolonising, your work as a practitioner academic, and the voluntary work you do, and setting up groups which are a form of resistance actually, and need, because actually we see the need in our communities. So thank you. And we're now going to go over to Professor Claire Warren.
Thank you, Geraldine. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So next we have Professor Claire Warren, who is a professor of metamorphic geology in the School of Environment, Earth and Ecosystem Sciences at the Open University. Apologies, I'm not familiar with a lot of the scientific language. I come from a humanities background, as I'm sure you can tell. Claire's research looks at the formation and destruction of mountain belts through the rocks that have been burned, heated, and deformed as tectonic plates collide. Sorry, it's foreign language to me. As well as heading out into the wilds to collect rocks to study back in the lab herself, Claire is also working to identify and remove barriers that restrict access to the field and nature for underrepresented and or minoritized groups. Environmental change affects society unequally and disproportionately. So a diverse cohort of earth and environmental scientists and protectors of nature is needed to future-proof environmental decision-making at all levels. So thank you, Claire. Apologies for the initial confusion. And I'm going to hand over to Geeta now to ask you questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, first of all, for agreeing to come on today. I know how busy your schedule is. like everyone who's been here today. So for a little bit of context, Claire is our only white speaker on the panel from day 1 and 2. And I'm sure, Claire, this will come out a little bit more later. I know how nerve-wracking that can be as the only speaker of colour. And the table is reversed now here today. Claire works at the Open University, and Claire and I actually, I think we came across each other through Dr. Giuliana. Maybe Dr. Giuliana put me in touch with you. And it was about a Landscape Stories project. And so we've worked on a couple of stories, storying the landscape project. And actually, our first interactions were rather uncomfortable, quite prickly. We talked about white privilege and power quite early on in the journey. I think I'd had a bad experience at that time. So I hope I didn't take it out on you in a way, but it was a way that I wanted to be transparent and say, before we start this research journey together, let's put some things on the table. Let's lay the ground about how we're going to operate together. So I want to start, Claire, by saying we do get on very well. We've become incredibly good friends through the work we're doing in our research and community grassroots work. And I've called you on the panel today, really, to talk about allyship. And there's a lot written, if you look at work by Nova Reid, for example, and other academics, on what does white allyship mean and look like. And we all know what white saviorism looks like, and there's a lot documented on that, where the white person comes in as a savior or, you know, shows empathy or sympathy. But the work you've done at the Open University, working with a grassroots community group like mine, Dudley Mars, which people aren't always open to an outsider coming in, particularly through a research angle. What lessons have you learned about allyship? Maybe you could just take it through, like Dirch has and Geraldine, this journey. Take us on your journey through allyship.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. It is incredibly nerve-wracking. Not quite as nerve-wracking as coming on the first walk with Daddy Maz, I must admit. But I'm so glad I did, and I'm so glad you welcomed me so with such open arms, because it's been a fabulous couple of years. So yeah, as a geologist and as an academic, I'm not coming to work in the outdoor spaces completely cold, obviously, because I do a lot of field work myself. And I've been working through sort of a lot of challenges with different groups of people. So, for example, there's a big problem for field work, especially geological field work, for disabled students, for example, both physically disabled, but also medically disabled. So access to toilets, access to knowing where we're going to be at what time, sort of planning around food, planning around the weather. So just thinking through sort of the barriers barriers to access for different groups of people. And then also in terms of LGBTQ and gender issues, I've worked, for my PhD, I worked in Oman on fieldwork, and I had to take a male cousin with me so that, I was not there on my own. And so sort of access to different parts of the world and different places, and where's safe and where's not safe. So all those kinds of ideas, an experience, I guess, I've brought to this work with you and to this friendship with you. I guess what this conference has taught me, and what working with Daddy Maz has taught me, is real problems with funding and access to funding, and the short-term nature and the tokenistic nature of funding for any kind of work around EDI spaces and access to anything really, specifically to green spaces. And the power imbalance between those who've got access to funding and those who don't. And then Kezia again was talking about how to navigate all the bureaucracy and the admin. And we've been trying at the Open University to get funding to work with different groups of people. And it's ridiculous, they pay for my time, but they won't pay for for the actual people who are delivering the work, or they won't pay for admin support. And admin support is the biggest thing, I mean, that you've always said you need an administrator, and that kind of funding just is not there. And that's, I think, really, really frustrating and really annoying. And the money doesn't need to be a big amount, but we need plenty of time to build up trust and to build up relationships. And sort of to start working through some of the barriers. But yeah, and trust is massively important for this, the white parachuting scientist, which we've spoken about at length.
Yeah, can I just hold you on that point about trust, Claire?
Yeah.
So I remember when you first came on a walk with me, and at the end of it, you reflected very honestly about how you felt, and how cautious you were about not overstepping boundaries. And you said, gosh, you feel like this all the time, Geeta. How do you do it? This is, just one occasion. This is how you feel all the time. And I've been in spaces before with different white friends where they've said the same, where the power imbalance has been reversed. Trust. Now, we know that funding projects tend to have a short-lived time span of a year or 6 months. Yeah, 6 months. So what questions has this raised for you in terms of this building trust relationships and working beyond the remit of funding? And how do you, navigate that?
Yeah, I guess it's about building friendships. It's about platforming different voices and issues, recognizing where different people hold power and maximizing that power, because power is held in different places. I might have the power to apply for funding, but I can't do anything with that funding without your power through Daddy Maz to do something with that and help work with you. Certainly in earth and environmental sciences, the lack of ethnic diversity, both in the academia and in industry and community groups, is horrific. It's just, we can't have meaningful conversations about climate change and about mental health and well-being without lots of different voices saying, here's how this affects my community, and we need to appreciate all these different barriers to problems in people who are living in areas where there's lots and lots of air pollution, for example, and there aren't enough trees to get rid of the air pollution. And unless there are voices there that say, hey, what about this group of people? And, we can't quite do it that way because of these problems. Like until Gertrude and Nazreen were talking about sunbathing in parks, that hasn't even ever occurred to me. So these conversations with lots of different voices going, this is a problem, this is a barrier, this is really important. And what I've loved about the Daddy Maz group is that you've invited lots of people into sharing those conversations and walking through nature together so that everybody can meet each other. It's not a closed group, and closed groups have their space, and it's critically important, but so are open groups, because otherwise we can't have these conversations and start talking to each other and learning from each other and building friendships. Basically, all of it is built on friendship. All allyship has to be built on friendship. Otherwise, there's no trust.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, because that I found is working with you on the project. Before I agreed to do any more, I almost wanted to see your track record of how you worked on one project. And something that was really instrumental to me as a woman of colour leading a group for Asian communities in the area where I am, is that you worked beyond the remit of the project. So that trust, those relationships were built over the course of a year. When people started to reach out to you for more support, and actually I wanted ambassadors in my community to say, actually, I don't have the expertise here. But actually, it was lovely how you offered to say, I'll give up my Saturday. I will work with members to upskill, to support. But actually, the power you know, Claire co-led a really beautiful walk with community ambassadors, but refused to have her name on it when I did. And if it was on social media, she'd say instantly, she would be, no, I have not, all I've done is facilitate. It's the ambassadors have done this. They're the ones who instigated and led it. Looking back, Claire, how do you feel about that uncomfortable conversation we had at the start of the journey of working together?
I'm so glad that that conversation happened, because I find it really difficult to not, I don't want to be perceived as the white parachute scientist. And so it was really important to have that. And I don't want to be that either, not alone be perceived as it. So it's really important to have those conversations and go, you know, to build trust with each other. And you're going, look, I don't want this to happen. And I was like, I don't want that to happen either. And what about this? And what about that? And how are we going to develop this together, really? Because I think that first project was all about trying to showcase careers in earth and environmental sciences to groups of people that we don't see in those careers at the moment. And there's an awful lot of bad press in, you know, programs like Friends and The Big Bang Theory. Like, geologists are just laughed at all the time. It's not a proper career, is it? It's a hobby, but it is a proper career, and it is important for everything from the energy transition to climate change. Geologists underpin the way the rocks underpin all of these conversations, and without the different voices around the table, we get a very one-sided view of what's needed and how to solve the problems. And so, yeah, thank you for allowing a few random geologists into your group to try and share our love of the rock beneath our feet. I mean, it's difficult.
What's really nice, Giuliana's just been saying whilst we were on mute, what's really nice, it's the different forms of knowledges that come together. And for the audience context, what we did with the Open University project is actually myself and community members. It was a team from the Open University, which included a diverse member, you know, someone from non-white background as well, and Giuliana. We worked in an interdisciplinary way to look at how do our knowledges come together. And when trust was built, we actually built the knowledges, we actually built space for the knowledges of our community ambassadors to also have space and credit their work, their voices, their opinions. So it was a process, and we're currently with the OU team about to write a paper on this, about the nature of how our voices have come together as academics, as community members, acknowledging the work that our community members have brought to that. So Claire, thank you for sharing that, and hopefully when the paper is released, we will have some more critical reflections on allyship, for sure. So thank you for that. I'm now going to shine the spotlight on Dr. Geeta from Leeds Beckett University, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Giuliana.
Thank you, Geeta. And thank you, Claire, for sharing your thoughts with us. Hello, Geeta. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to quickly introduce you. So Dr. Geeta Kay is a senior lecturer in race and education at Leeds Beckett University. She received a PhD in sociology from the University of Leeds and was recently awarded a senior fellowship of the Higher Education Academy. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Her teaching, writing, and research interests lie in intersectional ways of thinking through race, gender, and identity across multiple platforms, namely education, popular culture, graphic novels, and more recently, nature spaces. Her work so far has also been influenced by anti-racist pedagogies and decoloniality as a theoretical framework to examine South Asian representation. So thank you for being here today. Now, I'm actually some of our work really overlap.
Is it me or has it frozen?
It's frozen.
It's frozen. Okay.
Yeah, it's frozen.
I think it was frozen. Was it frozen? Or
Yes. Sorry, I got
okay, all right.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay,
yes.
we're back. Yeah.
Connection isn't stable. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm just going to start again.
Yeah.
Do I need to start from the beginning, Kavita?
No, it's fine. No, you can just carry on from where you are. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was about to say that Geeta, we have a lot of common interests. Geeta and I was at Brunel University last year before coming to the IOE, and Geeta and I taught Decolonizing the Curriculum module for our PGC students.
Lovely.
Yes, so we used a lot of, we used anti-racist pedagogies, critical pedagogies, and worked together with our students, student teachers, to then go out into schools and find ways to decolonize their practice and the curriculum. So
we have to have a conversation outside of this at some point, really soon.
Yeah, definitely we do.
Yeah.
So just coming back to your work, now you will lead on race education. A lot of your work is informed by that and Decolonizing University.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the implications that the seminar series raises for you? Can you give us some thoughts? Because obviously you're not a scientist, you don't work in STEM. So it's interesting to have your thoughts as an academic of ways in which we can work together in an interdisciplinary way, because I'm interested in interculturality as well, and languages. So there's lots of ways that we can all work together. So what are some of your thoughts around that?
Yeah, well, first of all, good morning, everyone. Before I go into that, Giuliana, I just wanted to say, first and foremost, thank you to Geeta and the organising team for inviting me today too. It has been such an enriching, heartwarming, and really energizing conference so far. Everyone in their own ways have been hugely inspiring. So I just wanted to say thanks to all of you guys. I think you're doing a fantastic job. I am quite green to this space, forgive the pun. So as you say, it's, I'm not a scientist, I don't come from that background, but I will say the multitude of ways in which, you and all the speakers have laid out in terms of how we can engage with nature is just absolutely fascinating and so valuable. And I really wish that I had this sort of in my early days of schooling and education. I think, perhaps my career path would have been quite different, but better late than never. But I do think, to answer your question, Giuliana, this is where the implications of the seminar series may manifest, and that's really in formal but also informal education. And I really do think there's a close linkage here to be made with the Decolonizing the Curriculum movement. So it's interesting that you've done work on that, because there really are synchronicities here that can be really unpacked in meaningful ways if, hopefully we're given the capacity to do that. But I'll talk a little bit about decolonizing the curriculum. So as most of you in this space would probably already know, it's become a hotly debated topic in recent years, with increasing calls for higher education institutions to address their colonial legacies and create more inclusive and equitable learning environments. Now, there's another debate to be had whether we see the decolonial debates evolving, or has it stagnated, or how do we even define that, as I think Geraldine mentioned earlier. I know we won't have the space to go into this today in this session, but I would take the position that I think it is evolving, but at a different pace perhaps. But I'd also further posit that the nature space and the green space is really in a key position to tackle that head on, really, and to really address and look at those processes of coloniality head on. And I think that's actually kind of happening through the Dadimas walks, for example, and all these kind of activities at a grassroots level that maybe aren't conceived or represented in that way, but I'm reading those as decoloniality in action. And broadly speaking, this really is about a movement that interrogates the ongoing impact of the legacies of colonialism and imperialism on knowledge production. And we see that, and I think Anjana's keynote on day one was really fascinating in that regard, when she spoke about the different types of knowledge production in regards to her area, and also what other writers such as Vandana Shiva, for example, talks about how nature has been historically conceived of and represented as through a Eurocentric lens, and how that was seen as something separate from human. But from what I can see, most spiritual belief systems across the global south, for the most part, have conceived of human, God, and the natural environment as one and not separate entities. So how now, when you think about how knowledge is produced, disseminated, and mainstreamed in this ethnocentric but pervasive way, it is really something that needs to be challenged. And I think it's happening, but we really do need to keep that going, because ethnocentrism is quite embedded in our outlook on most things. I'll give you one example. Grounding. A very simple practice of walking barefoot, on the natural ground. And it's about aligning your electrical energy by reconnecting to the earth. This was, as far as I know, for the longest time ridiculed as a backwards practice, as something that, just frankly ridiculed. The very notion of removing one's shoes didn't align with these, Western concepts of progress and modernity. And that was really aligned to, material urbanism. But we saw over lockdown, and again, Geraldine sort of mentioned this earlier, the surge in popularity of green spaces and this recognition of its value. I think that was a really important moment in terms of how it was recognized as having value to our health, our mental health, our well-being, our oneness with earth, with the land. But it also challenged dominant modes of thinking, and particularly for first-generation Asian migrants. So, for example, my parents, this idea of going outdoors, exploring the outdoors, was not something at the forefront of my upbringing or seen as, having any value. Again, because it didn't align with the concepts of, cosmopolitanism or being, modern, and which, assimilation was kind of the key sort of area of focus, if you like, in that time. But I will say one of the few positive outcomes to come of a lockdown was exactly this, how the conception of green spaces had changed with first generation South Asian migrants, but also, the second generation as well, who took to it in really interesting and fascinating ways. And some of you have spoken about this in this session. Another festival I can think of. So this is one in Trinidad that I got the opportunity to see during my fieldwork, and it's a festival called the Ganga Tara Festival. It's a one-day pilgrimage of Hindus at the Marianne River, and that takes place along the north coast of the island. And it was established, I think, in 1993, and continues to this day. So it's a yearly celebration of Ganga Ma, and this is a goddess associated with the Ganges River, a sacred river in India. Rivers are considered sacred across many belief systems. So it's very much it's become a multi-faith festival in that regard. But it's also seen as very much an environmental one in its focus on the landscape and how they sacralize the landscape as well as trees. I know Gert mentioned earlier how trees are sacred, are sacralized in the Sikh faith, and in a similar way, rivers and trees are in this festival too. So there is this outwardly focus on the environment. But as much as that, it was also a festival about honoring the Indian ancestors who came from India to the Caribbean under these very treacherous conditions in the 1800s, and made that journey across the Kalapani, the dark waters, to make a home in the Caribbean. So the offerings at the Gangadhara Festival is also an act of remembrance, an environmental festival, but also a way of coping with the transgenerational trauma of indentureship. So there's all these kind of multifaceted dimensions to this festival, which I think is fascinating, and which, I think there are probably more of these festivals across the globe that we necessarily wouldn't know about or have access to or learn about unless we seek them out. Perhaps there's even one here in the UK, but it'd be nice to know if they are, please do share. So I think it's of vital importance, and I think we can all agree, to put this politely, that for the most part, formal systems of education have been incredibly ignorant of contributions and beliefs and and multiple ways of knowing, as you mentioned earlier, Geeta, across the global south. And it's only now that this is being addressed and challenged. And I think this is where the work of decolonizing the curriculum comes into play. And I think by placing a spotlight on nature in education will really help advance those discussions. Because, I mean, I'll turn to the quote of Bell Hooks in this regard. She says, no education is politically neutral, right? And uses this example of how a white male professor, for example, in an English department, who only teaches work by great white men, is essentially making a political decision, right? So we are a living example of our politics. And again, I think this is where the work of decoloniality and decolonizing the curriculum comes into focus, and its deconstruction of existing hierarchies of knowledge and really drawing on multiple knowledge systems and ways of knowing and integrating that into curriculum. And for me, that's again, this seminar series has been really fascinating in that regard, because I've certainly learned in interdisciplinary ways, as you mentioned, Giuliana, and I've learned, much more, which I plan to bring into my own teaching. So really, it's to me less about reproducing systems of harm, which I think has been the case for a very long time, and more about reproducing systems of healing, which I think work in green spaces can do, if enabled and championed in that way, which I think some of us are doing. So yeah, I hope that answers that's part of your question.
Yes. Yeah, you have. Yeah, you've brought everything together quite beautifully, actually.
Thank you.
You've outlined this interdisciplinary nature of what Geeta and I are trying to do, just to bring together people from a STEM background, but also activists, and we are educators, Geeta and I. And we are very much interested in intercultural dialogue, in languages, anti-racist education. So you brought it all together really well, Kavita. So thank you. And I think in terms of highlighting the importance of changing the curriculum in schools, but also in higher education, is quite connected really to nature and green spaces as well, and the ways in which we think about visibility and representation for communities in spaces from which they've been quite clearly excluded for a long time. So the notion of belonging as well, Geeta, like we talked about earlier, who belongs where, and who is seen as not belonging where. And so all of this is giving us a lot of food for thought in terms of next steps.
I agree, Giuliana, and you've really touched on some such important points in relation to conversations that Giuliana and I have had. And I really like the phrase you used, decolonizing in action, the knowledges in this space. There has to be space for diverse knowledges. And the festival you talked about in Trinidad as well. And I know that Anjana's work, particularly in her keynote, talked about the sacred nature, and it brought in that spiritual religious dimension, which Gertrude's work is doing as well. It's often dismissed in the West. And actually, I've had white conservationists who have come to me and said, I don't think our work is really touching on this. And this is an area we need to learn about. That where you talked about rivers as sacred, trees as sacred, and growing up, I remember the plants in our home, they were sacred. We weren't allowed to just touch them. My mum would wake up and pray to the plants. It's, there is this, you look at the Dulce plant, which is sacred as well. So you're bringing, you and Anjana, you're bringing in those conversations about honouring diverse knowledge forms as well. And how you've linked the importance of linking decolonizing education to the decolonizing of green spaces. And actually, that's what sparked this conference. It's when Giuliana and I were planning our module on decolonizing education that we thought actually nature has, there's a lot of power in nature here.
Absolutely.
And also languages, the power of languages, because there are different ways to relate to nature in different languages as well.
Yeah.
So that's also an interesting
Yeah.
connection.
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, Geeta said it when in the conservation world that, you know, it has its own language, and I guess each sector has its own vocabulary and language, which, you know, I'm not familiar with. I'll hold my hands up and say that. But I mean, that's not to say that, you know, we don't have an interest in this. From my own personal point of view, it really, my interest skyrocketed over lockdown. It was such just the very idea of, again, walking outside and going, I mean, you know, we are aware of those practices, but it really wasn't something I, you know, fully gave that credence or that importance to. But my God, when we were sort of living that time, it was so healing and such a, just like invigorating in every which way. But then that actually led to my, it deepened my interest in terms of the readings and the work that had been done on this. And, you know, anecdotally, I knew from speaking to people in the communities and also within my own families how, you know, things like, again, grounding, forest bathing, and all of this, we were familiar with these concepts, but they were dismissed because, again, it was not seen as something modern people do. It's seen as, you know, it's backwards, it's what we did in the village, and we're trying to escape all this. So again, but to me, again, that's exactly, that's coloniality in action, that you're holding on to these views. But actually, these were really, you know, there were sacred practices in their own way. So now it became, in addition to all of that, it also became a reclamation of space. And I think this is where what's Black Girls Hike, I think is the name of the group, and all these other kind of groups that are now coming up. I think, you know, fair play to them and hats off, because I think it's actually incredible. It is very much take the space. I think you should, because that's exactly, you know, we've been denied it in so many ways for the longest time, or, you know, or we've internalized these sort of, you know, concepts of coloniality, if you like. So in challenging that and going outdoors, I think is, again, decoloniality in action, and I'd massively champion that in every which way. And I think it's very important to engage with that, because it's there for everyone. You know, it's not about appropriation or ownership. And all those kind of ideals. But I think as we navigate a post-pandemic world, I don't know if we're coming to the end, sorry, I'll try and wrap up. I think this is where there's some interesting, some really rich work coming out now, and I hope it continues in that same vein. Corinne Fowler's work on the country houses and connections to the empire, I think is it's a fascinating one to watch. And I think if we have more in line with the principles of the Decolonising the Curriculum movement, if we have more meaningful teaching, again, inside the schools, but also outside of the schools in community groups, on the relationship between colonialism and culture, colonialism and the countryside and the natural environment, for example, I think it would certainly go a long way in increasing and improving the current conversations on race in 21st century Britain, which, as we know, is incredibly fractured and toxic at the minute. But I think that would be certainly a good place to start, as well as representation, which I think someone mentioned earlier on. At all levels, you know, cultural and organization change needs to happen. So it can't just be about tick boxing. It's very much about involving communities of color in decision-making processes and demonstrating real engagement, all with the end goal of making all communities feel welcome in these spaces. That's my view, because we certainly saw these imbalances in parks and green spaces participation, which Nasreen, I think, mentioned earlier. So, you know, we all need access to nature and open green spaces as an antidote to, you know, the everyday stresses of living in the city. So it's I mean, those barriers certainly need to be challenged and addressed, and I think that work is happening. In terms of the academy, I think we certainly have a long way to go, because I don't see that's being enabled and funded perhaps in the same, you know, in meaningful ways. But you know, that's something.
I think it's very good at capturing something and make it institutionalize it without making actually any real changes, right?
Yes.
But I think you also highlight the importance of informal education, not just formal education in schools or university, but also the kind of education that happens within communities, the informal aspects, very, very important.
Mm.
Thank you so much, Kavita.
Thank you.
I think we're going to have a quick break now,
Yeah,
right? 5
so,
minutes maybe?
Yeah, I think what we will do now, we have had some astonishing speakers. We really have, and we will at the end of the conference this morning share our next steps. We're going to give you 5 minutes. If you could aim to be back by 12:05. We have Maxwell and Mohammed. I'm not sure if Adia would like to be a panelist as well, but we will raise, because I know you've had logging in issues. Adia, we're going to try and put you in as a panelist. So we'll have about 15 minutes with the panelists from day one, those who were able to come today. And then Giuliana has very kindly agreed to wrap up some key messages from today, and then we'll do our thank you. So 5 minutes, and we'll see you soon. We're going to hand over to Giuliana now to pull it together.
Over to you, Giuliana.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and apologies that I arrived late into the conference. However, I've managed to ask folks to send me summaries of points in the 40 minutes that I missed, so I've incorporated those into the closing comments. I have sent everybody a Google document link where you'll be able to see some of the notes that I've taken for the speakers that I heard today. And I think it's really interesting to begin to focus on actions and moving forward. I think Mohammed is absolutely right in the sense that conversations about inequity, and particularly race inequity and access to nature, has been going on for 20, 30, 40 years. And I think there is fatigue now in really going over and over and over again about the barriers that ethnically diverse communities face in accessing green spaces. We're really tired of that. I think put into these closing comments are very much drawn on now, let's look forward. And I was really interested in what Geraldine had to say, actually, and she's probably, I don't know if you're conscious of this, Geraldine, but you said 3 words which were really critical. 4 words, actually. One is you mentioned the word journey, and journey is a word that I'm currently sitting in a space right now because I'm writing a book, and I'm thinking about another book called The Journey to the Center of the Earth. So journey is quite a big word for me at the moment. But this whole conference is setting out a journey towards decolonizing green spaces. You know, and my own journey in my head, I'm thinking about the inner core of the earth and heading up towards the earth's crust. And I have to say that this is even more challenging than that journey of understanding the interior of the earth, because we are dealing with life situations, huge barriers of gatekeeping of power, which has been brought up, that almost seem insurmountable. But the positive side of this is that I almost feel like we've got a manifesto for change after these 2 days of discussions about lived experience and insights and expertise and knowledge beyond what sits within the natural heritage sector. And Geraldine mentioned 3 words, which are really the pathway towards change. The first word is development. The second word you said was progression. And the third word you said was growth. And that is a critical stage of a journey that we and also other partners in the natural heritage sector can follow. And if we begin with development, the question that I thought, and this is a question I always ask organizations, I'm sure you do as well, and it's also worth asking ourselves as well, is what is triggering the start of this journey? What is triggering the organization, and predominantly white organizations in the green space, green and blue spaces? What is triggering their journey into EDI? What is triggering our journey to ask for greater equity? And the points that I've picked up on is, number one, it's that funding landscape. And I've sat on panels at National Lottery Heritage Fund, and I've constantly brought up this issue that there is a gatekeeping of power within organizational structures, so that they are the ones applying for the funding and delivering crumbs to the community groups. So the expertise, the money, the power, the decision making is kept within organizations. And one of the key challenges that we need to put towards funders, Esme Fairburn, National Lottery, and all sorts of other funders, Arts Council, is really pushing against that structure that organisations hold the expertise and the power. They certainly have the mechanisms to apply for the funding, but they need to work within an equitable framework with the communities they want to work with. I also recognise that diversity washing is rampant throughout the sector at this moment in time. We see lots of examples of organisations wanting to jump in on funding pots and scrabbling around for community groups to work with. And because community groups find it so difficult to access money, we almost allow ourselves to be used in that way. So this manifesto really has to give power to the communities and to provide them with the power to say no if they are being used in that way, if they are being used as tokenistic pawns for that big organisation to access money, and demand equity in that process. The development phase of this journey also examines how Gertch brought this up. How can you learn to play the game? And I think community groups in particular, need to better understand what organizations mean by strategy and policy. And this is a really critical framework that they use to define business plan, funding applications, boards, for example, even the skills that they need on boards. And I think community organizations need to learn and understand how to step into that space, so they're speaking that language and understand how to move within those circles to influence the strategy and the policy, because that is where the major decisions are made. And then, as Gertch said, you then move into that action, you then move into projects that are delivering what you hope to see. So there is this kind of dual narrative about mainly white organizations working in the natural heritage sector relinquishing power and relinquishing their gatekeeping of power to work more equitably with communities, and then community groups to move into spaces where they do understand how the system works and how they can set about to influence strategy and policy to then lead to action, the action that they want to see for their communities. That's a development stage of this manifesto. And then as we move into progression, I've asked a question: what do you, and you means organizations, it means community leaders, it means you as individuals, what do you need to set in place to begin that journey towards greater equity of access and power within the natural heritage spaces? I think lots of us have talked about trust, and Claire in particular talked about avoiding parachute science and avoiding parachute projects. And Gertch brought up the issue of developing and progressing projects with greater empathy and genuine authenticity. So it's shifting the model. And again, organizations are really struggling to do this. And this is within museums and this is within the natural heritage sector. They're struggling to move into spaces where they're delivering with communities and understanding co-production practice in its truest sense, rather than we've already set this program up and we're going to run focus groups and ask you what you think of this that we've already designed for you, and now we're going to roll with this. That is not true co-production practice. So when we talk about progression at this stage of the manifesto, it's really as community groups standing up and saying, you know, we will not engage with you unless we are fully involved in a co-productive process. And that is setting out that earlier stage of the manifesto, which is relinquish your power in this space. I think Claire brought this issue up. I think it's a really critical issue. It's about delivering according to capacity. And I think this is really a message to organizations who wish to work with diverse communities, because trust takes a very, very long time to build. We're not talking about months, we're talking about years. And this needs to be done at capacity. So your eyes can be bigger than your stomach, particularly if you're applying for grants and you think, I want as massive impact as possible. And how do we do that as quickly as possible to achieve the results, to show the board, and et cetera, et cetera. But actually, small scale projects that are built on genuine trust, genuine authenticity, have a greater chance of success, and then growing from that small kernel to become more sustainable and less tokenistic. And I thought this was really interesting what Geeta said, focusing on producing and supporting systems of healing rather than maintaining systems of harm in green spaces. I thought that was really profound, actually, because I think the words tokenism and the funding structures and the short-term nature and the inequity in relationships without challenging those systems and structures, what organizations and communities inadvertently are enabling is supporting and upholding the systems of harm. And I think if we begin, if such a board was to exist, they would help communities to step up and refuse to be involved in projects that perpetuate systems of harm rather than systems of healing. And I think that takes a lot of courage to look at an organization in the face and say, you haven't involved us in this process, you've not consulted us, we are not an equitable partner on this grant application, I'm afraid we have to step away. And actually that has greater power and greater influence than being part of the system of harm. So I thought that was a really powerful statement, actually, and I hadn't really thought about it in that way until Kavita had brought that up. And the final stage of this manifesto, the final stage of this journey, is growth. And here is the really critical part that, from my experience of working in learning and engagement, probably for 20 years plus, with all sorts of learning teams in natural heritage and museums, this is where sometimes organizations, and particularly learning and engagement teams, fail. They really fail to understand and evaluate and kind of reflect on impact of projects and really reflect on progress. And I think all of the academic researchers have brought this up. Its knowledge and expertise takes many forms, and it's understanding how to evaluate and use research effectively to then build a strategy that is built on a culture of healing. And I love that system of healing, a system of healing in the green space. If you do your evaluation, if you provide effective mechanisms to understand the impact of the project and do your research and listen to the voices, do you then end up in an environment where the work is more equitable, that the organization is more empathetic and genuinely understanding the experiences of that community, which they're then feeding back into the system? So it's almost like a cycle, a positive feedback, to then move into a space where you go back to the start of the journey again and you're building projects with that community. I think Gertch said this, that wrong turns and U-turns are okay, and actually they're points for learning. And any person who works in evaluation and research will tell you that mistakes and kind of mess ups are ways to reflect on what went wrong, so you actually do better the next time. Any scientist will also tell you that as well. I also think it's really important to recognize that Claire said this, and Claire and Geeta both reflected on this, working beyond the remit of the project. I've done this my entire career because I'm genuinely invested in helping people to appreciate and understand earth sciences. But what are organizations doing to work beyond the remit of the project to build trust and engagement? Doesn't necessarily have to be more hours put in, it's how you spend that time. So beyond the remit of the project refers to the quality of how you spend your time that you have allocated to that process of engagement. Are you using that time effectively to step into the spaces where the communities are, to understand their needs, their wants, their empathetic, building that empathetic relationship and structure, rather than we're going to go away into our tower, design a whole bunch of programs, and then we're going to deliver this to the community? That is not an effective way of using time, and it also doesn't take you beyond your project boundaries. So it's quite an interesting question that was brought up, working beyond the remit of the project. And I think on a final note, I think point number 3 here, and I just want to reiterate this because I think this stretches all the way across the sector, whether you're an artist or a scientist or a community worker or a social scientist, is that knowledge and expertise takes many forms. And Rick Holloman's on this call, and Geeta and Rick, they taught me a new word. Actually, they taught me this word called situated knowledge, and that was a life-changing moment for me, because I thought, I've known this all my career, but I didn't know there was a word for it. That knowledge and expertise takes many forms, and actually bringing together situated knowledge, bringing together that diverse myriad, that diverse range of knowledge, of voices, enriches the sector. And organizations, predominantly white organizations, need to realize the value of that. And as diverse community groups, we need to be better at championing and recognizing and empowering our voices to be heard. Thank you so much. Sorry, Geeta, that was it. I don't know if you want to come in.
Well, we just a round of applause.
Yeah,
Thank you, John.
that was really, really helpful, Anjana. The way you pulled together some pertinent points, and we will be creating an ebook of the key points as well after this conference, and be sharing it with institutions as well. And thank you for sending the Google Doc as well to us. If you could email that, would be great. So you could unpin Anjana. We're just going to come to our final thank yous now, really. And the final thank yous really are to the panelists for day 1 and 2. I want to start by thanking Giuliana, because if it wasn't for the two of us coming up with the module that we did together on decolonising education, it was a very uncomfortable module that we taught for various reasons. And our student teachers didn't find it easy going into schools using the word decolonising in schools. So we had to do quite a lot of nurturing behind the scenes, healing work ourselves actually as part of the journey. And we will be writing about some of the trauma and healing that we've had to go through as part of actually putting on this conference even. It should have been these conferences, these spaces, these awards can be real celebratory events, but actually when they touch on points like racism, decoloniality, trauma, actually what does it do to those people who are putting these events on? So there's a lot that happens behind the scenes, which we'd like to be quite upfront and open about and write about. Please do, so thank you to Giuliana for working with me, and actually it's my very first conference series, and Giuliana is more experienced than me, so I've learned a lot from her during this process. And we have some exciting plans for next year based on the conversations today and some of the work that Giuliana is doing. It might be a good point now, Giuliana, just to say a little bit of the work that where your knowledge is situated at the Institute.
Yes, so I'm part of the International Centre for Intercultural Studies at the Institute of Education. And my work really is on interculturality. So it has been fairly theoretical up to this point. I'm really interested about the relationship between language and culture and its application to education. And also I'm interested, of course, on decoloniality and inequality, particularly related to language. As I'm sure you all have gathered, I'm a second language speaker, so I'm a non-native English speaker, and there's a lot of inequalities around being a native speaker of English. So I'm very interested in that. And so my work in the Intercultural Centre revolves around these different aspects of inequality. And so Geeta and I were thinking how we can all bring all this work together. And we are planning to set up a similar symposium next year, where we want to bring together nature, different ways to think about nature through different cultural lenses and different languages. Particularly after Anjana's amazing keynote, there were so many ideas that we are going to build on moving forward. Linking faith, interfaith dialogue, different kinds of knowledges and different ways to think about nature, and what are the implications for community work, engaging with diverse communities who speak different languages, and also how do we translate all of that into education. Apologies if I'm rambling a bit, but I'm just thinking now, but there's so much really that Geeta and I want to do now. And a lot of it is practical, and we really want to be able to engage in interdisciplinary dialogue with different kinds of people, academics and activists.
Thank you, Giuliana. So we have plans for next year. some of you have led us now to think about this idea of a board as well. So let us ponder that in terms of what it would look like. So yeah, we might be sending out an email on that matter. We launched this series on International Women's Day, and understand that word woman is also contested. And when we spoke to Jasmine on day one, she looked at it through an intersectional queer lens for people of colour. So this word woman is contested as well and can be seen in so many ways. We launched the book on that day. Now, if you know any women of colour who you think should feature in that book for us to amplify, please do let us know, because we're keeping that book open and it's electronic so that we can keep on shining a light there.
And we are inclusive in our understanding of womanhood.
Yes.
Just to make that clear.
Yeah, we are inclusive in terms of that. There will be an ebook following this conference with key messages from each speaker on day one and day two. And that's a good point to kind of give a big shout out to Giuliana's doctoral research student, who is Michelle Lee, who has been incredible during this process. Let's get Michelle here quickly. And she's doing her doctorate at the moment. And it's been incredible working with Michelle because, well, actually, Michelle, have you enjoyed this or not?
Yes, of course. I've learned a lot of new concepts that I actually haven't thought about. And I come from Hong Kong, and it's really monocultural. We don't talk about lenses from different cultural backgrounds, different history, and we only speak one language. And coming here today and the first day, it really opens up my mind and think about how nature is to me as a Hong Konger, and as so many people in the talk today. So I really enjoyed every single minute of it, and thank you for the opportunity as well.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. And obviously, we wish Michelle every success with her doctorate, which is going to be touching on decoloniality as well. So she is doing a lot, heavily involved in her reading at the moment. So there will be an ebook. The Interculturality for Diversity and Global Learning Research Group at Brunel University has a web link. We will be uploading the ebooks to that space, and the International Women's Day book is there already. And Giuliana's work is situated in the International Centre for Intercultural Studies at the Institute of Education, UCL. And that will be, again, we're going to be doing some more work in partnership next year. So watch this space for what we do there. And this conference wouldn't have been possible. And we were very, very careful in who we invited. Some of the people we've invited are through connections. We've taken time to speak to people before the conference and really think of what they're bringing to the table in this dialogue, without falling into the trap of replicating old messages and research. And so far, what we do feel is that critical voices have been brought here, bold as well, and some bold messages have been shared. And we also recognise, actually, in sharing those bold messages, you can feel quite vulnerable as well. I actually said something on Twitter last night, which almost deleted, and it was sharing my own vulnerability as an academic of colour. When we are talking about topics related to racism, decoloniality, we are always fearful to some degree of the gaze, of social media trolling, which I've experienced before because of my work as a community activist alongside academic. And I know Anjana has faced this as well, as have groups like Muslim Hikers and others as well. So thank you to everybody who's been here, because we haven't had a budget for this, sadly, to be able to kind of pay people for their time. But if we do ever secure a budget with an organisation, hopefully we can pay people for their time that they deserve for giving up, you know, the preparation and the time to actually speak and share. And we hope that, you know, this conference will make an impact in the right spaces.